wave god in this motherfucker. Hey, shout my nigga Demi Tito.
Got song pop like I'm Iggy. All they talking about is last night like I'm Demi. Say you got
It's Ink, the godfather of the Irish Drill Show, and my boy Demi TV.
Damn ski pole to Michael Jackson.
Let's see what the chat thinks. Let's see. Cause that nigga Demi was like, I'm king.
So Dean Fam and Dean H, today we're doing a reaction to Human Anatomy. I forgot what, I think that's what it's called. If I'm wrong, correct me in the comment section below. But that's neither here or there. You feel me? If you're new to the channel, like, comment, subscribe, and share the video on all social media. And comment below what reaction you want me to do next. And check out the original video in the description below. Road to 100K, million, and a billion. So click that subscribe button. Let's birthday as a family, as a nation. And today we're doing what tattoos do to the skin. We're going to see what tattoos do to the skin, because I'm pretty sure some people got them. A majority of people got them. If not, at least 80% of people got tattoos. You feel me? So comment below if you got a tattoo, leave a thumbs up. You feel me? But check out DNTV color in the description box below also. You feel me? And go show your boys me some support and love. You feel me? And no further ado, let's get into this reaction.
Did you know about 1 out of every 3 people have a tattoo, and that number can go over 40% if you just take into consideration the younger generations?
Facts.
So I think it's important that we use real human skin to go over the anatomy of tattoos, or in other words, how tattoos work. Like, what layer does the ink specifically go into? And why doesn't our body try to get rid of the ink? Because it's technically a foreign substance. Also, what do we mean by tattoos are permanent? Because certain things can cause tattoos to fade with time. Obviously, we have some questions to answer, so let's do this.
Human anatomy.
So if we're going to talk about how tattoos work, we definitely need to have a basic understanding of the skin. The skin belongs to a system called the integumentary system, or just the integument. It's comprised of 3 main layers from top to bottom, or superficial to deep, starting with the epidermis, then the dermis, and then the hypodermis, also known as the subcutaneous layer.
Yeah.
We're definitely going to take a look at all 3 of these
Damn,
layers.
I learned this shit in fucking science and freaking high school. What the fuck?
But I have to mention something
hearing this shit is crazy.
It's
like getting a fucking blast from the past hearing these words.
Each one of these layers, the epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis, is made out of a completely different tissue when you compare it to the other.
Yeah.
In other words, the epidermis is made out of a totally different tissue than the dermis, and the dermis is made out of a totally different tissue than the hypodermis. Why is that important? Because the nature of the tissue will definitely influence how ink is deposited in that layer, how permanent the ink is in that layer, and even just how the tattoo works. Or in other words, it influences how the ink is going to behave in each individual layer. So let's start with that epidermis. So here we've got 2 skin grafts here. Let's start with this one. And this outer layer here is the actual epidermis. I always find it interesting when we bring the aesthetic students in here. They always notice the freckles and the sun damage here. But this epidermis, if I show you the cut edge, is just that top paper thin layer there. The majority of the tissue that you see here is actually, let me get into focus, is the dermal tissue. Just that top paper thin edge is the epidermis, which is pretty remarkable because it can be up to 50 cell layers thick. And the epidermis is your protective layer, and it's made out of a tissue called epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is a highly cellular tissue, and what I mean by that is that the cells are just packed together and stacked on top of each other. Like I mentioned earlier, can be up to 50 cell layers thick and sometimes more. But to the naked eye, that's only about 0.1 millimeters, so relatively thin from our perspective. But what happens is these cells that are at the bottom of the epidermis, or this epithelial tissue that makes up the epidermis, they copy themselves. And so when one cell copies itself, one of the copies goes on top. Guess what happens next? It makes another copy, and the cell that was right here gets pushed up, and the new copy comes underneath it. And that continues to happen, and cells move upward. As the cells move upward closer to the surface, they start to flatten out and die because they get pushed further from the blood supply. And we don't care about that. because those dead flat cells give us a nice protective barrier from friction and abrasion. That's what I'm doing here, not itching my skin here, but protects us from that friction and abrasion. And that process just continues on every single day. Now, as the cells move up, eventually they're going to get to the very top and flake off. You can shed over 1 million cells per day.
I believe
You can
it.
think that's disgusting, but it's anatomy, so it technically is under the classification of being awesome. Now, kind of think about that with how that influences tattoo and ink deposition. This wouldn't be a great layer to tattoo or put ink into, but the reality is some of the ink, as it is being injected into the skin, does get deposited to this layer and therefore some of the cells. But as you know, because those cells are moving upward, eventually any ink that's in there is going to flake off. It takes around 4 weeks or so for a cell to get from the bottom to the top. So any of the ink that does get deposited in there,
Interesting.
you can see it's pretty much scattered throughout your house as dust. So the next layer down is extremely important to tattooing and ink deposition.
That's why I need a purifier, humidifier type
And as
shit.
we mentioned earlier, this was called the dermis. So let's take a look again at the cadaver dissection. Remember, the majority of this cut edge here was the dermis, or the dermal tissue, where that paper-thin top was the epidermis. The epidermis, again, made of epithelial tissue, but the dermis, or this dermal tissue, is made out of a totally different tissue called dense, irregular connective tissue.
What?
And it's the nature of this dense, irregular connective tissue that allows ink to be deposited and for it to last many, many years, or what we would think of as permanent. And so for us to more fully appreciate how the ink can be permanent or relatively permanent in this layer, we're going to zoom into this cut edge of the dermis here, like on a little magic school bus ride, by zooming in to the model here. So this would be that same cut edge here, and to orient you, this would be the epidermal layer here, or the epidermis. And from my thumb to my pointer down here would be the dermis.
That's
Now,
all that's going
very
on.
different tissues, the epidermis and the
Little
dermis. Remember,
compact
this had
skin,
tons of
compact
cells
skin,
packed
in
together,
other
the
words.
epidermis. But the dermis, we wouldn't see that. We'd see only a few cells scattered throughout the spaces between all these other structures. And those cells are important because they are called fibrocytes. And they produce a protein fiber called collagen, one of the most abundant proteins in the human body. Now, the model is actually trying to show you, if we zoom into it, the fiber orientation of the collagen. You can see some lines going this way, some other lines in between the other spaces going in other directions, and that is why the tissue, or the dermis, is referred to as a dense, irregular connective tissue, because the collagen fibers are going in all directions, which we'll talk about the interaction with ink here soon. But because the collagen is going in all directions, it gives skin its strength to be tugged on in every which way there, or in other words, all directions. Now, the skin is not just made up of, or I should say specifically the dermis, is not just made up of fibrocytes and collagen. As you can see from the skin model, there are a whole bunch of other structures in here. We've got sweat glands, blood vessels coming through here, nerve endings, and even hair follicles that have pushed down from the epidermis. So again, how does this anatomical knowledge help us understand how tattoos work in this layer? Well,
we're
ink
like
is
a
being
black hole.
deposited into the dermal layer, and a lot of that ink is going to get suspended in that collagen matrix.
Everything just
And some of it
swallowing
will
and
be even
compact
taken up
almost.
by those fibrocytes, or those cells I mentioned earlier. But that's not the only thing that's going on here. You see, during tattooing, a needle is puncturing the skin at anywhere from 50 to 3,000 times per minute. That's creating trauma, as well as injecting a foreign substance into the skin. Now, usually when our body deals with trauma or a foreign substance gets introduced, our immune system has something to say about that, and the inflammatory process gets activated. Now, we could do a whole video just on the process of inflammation, but one of the main take-home points for us is that inflammation is getting white blood cells to the site of injury, infection, or to deal with foreign substances. And that's what happens during the tattoo process. White blood cells get called to the area, they'll leave these blood vessels, and then go roam through the tissue, which is a really interesting thing because these cells, specifically these white blood cells called macrophages, are these little engulfers. In other words, they engulf or take up foreign substances. That could be viruses, that could be bacteria, dead tissue, and debris. But in this case, they start trying to engulf the ink. Now, that engulfment process is a technical term called phagocytosis. And typically, once a white blood cell phagocytizes or engulfs something, it starts to break it down and digest it. However, it's used to breaking down and digesting biological substances. Ink can include dye, plastics, and even solids that our immune system or our white blood cells are not really equipped to break down very well or digest. So what's the solution? We think with some of the research that's leading to this is instead of being able to break it down because they can't, it's more of like, let's isolate it and contain it and not let this ink go to other areas of the body. So that's pretty crazy to think about. Those white blood cells getting some of that ink from the collagen, they'll even engulf some of the dead fibrocytes, and that ink stays in them, and you can see that through the surface of the skin. And the idea is that those white blood cells just kind of stay put there. And if you're like me, you're kind of thinking, white blood cells don't last a person's lifetime. So how is that staying there for the majority of this tattoo or for the length of a person's life? Because tattoos are relatively permanent. What they have started to find is that when the macrophages that engulf the ink, when they die, they release the ink. And then guess what happens? A new macrophage comes in and engulfs that ink. So it's almost like this engulf-release, this kind of cyclic process that happens to maintain the tattoo in that area.
Interesting.
But remember I mentioned the whole idea, at least the going theory, is we're going to just contain the ink here. And it does obviously a pretty good job because those of you who have tattoos or seen people with tattoos, you notice the tattoo doesn't like migrate or move, but you do notice that it sometimes fades with time.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of going theories with this. One is that as a macrophage dies and releases that ink, the new incoming macrophage engulfs most of the ink. And some of the smaller broken down ink particles will get taken away into the lymphatic vessels. We know that some of the ink gets into the lymphatic system because they've done biopsies on distant lymph nodes and found tattoo ink in there. So that is likely contributing to the fading of tattooing over time. Granted, other things like UV light can fade tattoos and break the ink down, but that's one of the ideas of how these are relatively permanent with some changes over time. Now, one other thing I need to address. Some of you may be thinking, Jonathan sure has used the phrase foreign substance multiple times throughout the video.
Yeah.
Should I be worried about getting a tattoo or even worried about the tattoo that I already have? And no, not so much. We've used foreign objects or substances in things like surgeries, like knee replacements, or metal rods for like repairing major fractures or for support of those bones, even mesh for things like hernia repairs. Now, that doesn't mean people haven't had reactions to those substances or even reactions to tattoo ink, but the majority of people do just fine. The most important parts of getting a tattoo are, one, going to a reputable tattoo artist that uses precautions to help mitigate risk of infection and reactions, as well as this other important concept when it comes to getting a tattoo, and that is aftercare. And that's why I really love the sponsor of this video called Sanoderm Medical. They truly understand the importance of aftercare and even skincare prior to and during the tattooing process. Like I said, I want to say thank you to the sponsor of this video,
I probably needed some shit. Shit. That's why a lot of us need shit who get tattoos or got tattoos.
Sterile, clear, breathable wound bandages.
There's a W promo for guys like that DNA shit.
That expertise in protecting the skin. Sunburn in the code IOHA.
Okay, promo.
Go
back to the video, baby. Okay.
So that takes care of the most important layer when it comes to tattooing, the dermis. However, we mentioned epidermis, dermis, hypodermis or subcutaneous layer, and that hypodermis or subcutaneous layer is still important to some topics with tattooing, specifically a topic known as blowout, or when the tattoo lines start to blur. So let's dive into that. So again, let's go back to our skin dissection here. And here was the dermal edge here, but I'm going to rotate it over. And if you look closely, you can see some yellowy tissue, especially down here on the bottom edge here. And that is the hypodermis. And the hypodermis, again, made out of a different tissue than the two above, is made of adipose tissue or fatty tissue. If I go to the other dissection, you can see it even better. You can see all of that yellowy tissue is the hypodermis and, again, fatty tissue. Now, the nature of this tissue is kind of more of an oily type of a tissue. And if ink gets down into that layer, because of the nature of the oily tissue, it can kind of blur the lines, or it almost looks like it kind of like dissipates into the skin a little bit more. And again, adipose. Think of kind of the interactions between oils, which would be fats, and other liquid substances, and you can kind of get that idea of why it might start to blur the lines here.
Okay, so
now, there's another
water,
really important concept to think about as far as why are some areas more at risk for blurring than others, and that is a discussion of skin thickness. And when we're talking about skin thickness, I love to show these two cadaver dissections because this skin dissection and this one right here that I'll bring a little closer in a second are from the same cadaver. Look at the thickness of the dermis here. This is from the mid-back of a cadaver. And then I come to this, and you can see it's just so much more flimsy, and that edge is mostly the dermal tissue from the same person or same cadaver, but this came from the lower leg. Now, I'm not a tattoo artist, but when I've talked to tattoo artists, they talk about the idea of what causes a blurred line or blowout, and that tends to deal with pressure of how much they push on the skin. Now, if you push harder, the idea is some of that ink might get more likely pushed down into the hypodermis, but it's also influenced just on the region. You almost have more give or more room for error in the dermis on the mid-back, as opposed to, say, something on the lower leg where the dermal tissue is thinner, and so it wouldn't take as much pressure to get the ink down into the hypodermis and potentially cause some of that blurring or blowout. So now we've made it through all three layers of the skin and gave us this idea about how important the nature of the tissue is in influencing what happens with the tattoo ink. We know the epidermis, if any of the ink gets in those cells, flakes off after about 4 weeks. The dermis is where we want all the majority of that ink, the most stable, for permanence and nice crisp artwork. And we now know the hypodermis, more at risk for bleeding out or blurring or that blowout because of the nature of the adipose and that oily tissue underneath. Thanks for watching the video, everyone, and thank you again to Sanoderm for...
Like that video, and then like, comment, subscribe, share the video, and also